Hello again, and welcome to the Curious Vlog. It is February 27th when I'm posting this video. I apologize that there was no January video. I did record one, ahead of time no less. And then on the day of posting it, I watched it again and decided it was kind of overwhelming. So I recorded another one. And that one was good in the first half, but I went a little bit long and I realized that the second half was kind of dull. And I said to myself, if I would just finally download and install the editing software, I could just chop off the second half of the video and leave it right there, and that would be good enough. But I know how much work the world of editing is, and I really hope to keep these just unedited, single-take videos for as long as possible, because video editing is a lot of work. And time is something to be carefully prioritized. So I vacillated for a couple of days, and then it was late, and then I said to myself, you know what, I missed it. It sucks that I missed it, but I missed it, and I can't really post a video on the 27th now that it's February. So here we are at the end of February. I'm actually recording this way ahead of time, so that if anything goes wrong, I can make another one. Today, I picked a couple of topics to talk about. First one should be of interest for many an aspiring writer out there, which is, what is this writer's darkest fear? What is this writer's worst nightmare as a writer? And I will tell you the answer to that. I was talking with a friend of mine a couple of days ago, and she was very frustrated because she has been trying to interact critically with a community on the internet, and you probably can imagine that a sentence like that is often going to go wrong. There are a lot of unreasonable behaviors on the internet. So she'd been really frustrated. She felt like she had some good points and wanted to... She wasn't trying to bash the community. She was trying to improve upon the community. And I suppose, yeah, that's a Sisyphean task in many cases. In any case, she did mention that even the one person she liked the most and found the most open rubbed her the wrong way, because there were a number of reasons, but the thing that's relevant here is that this person had friends in the community, and she hated them. She liked him, but she hated his friends, or hate is too strong a word, but didn't like them. And I said that that's because we don't know people very well. Nobody knows people very well. There are maybe a few people in your entire life whom you will know very, very closely, and it's not going to be all of your friends. It's not going to be all of your family for sure. It's just a handful of people whom you really get to know. There are people out there who don't even really know their spouses all that well, or their kids, and it boggles the mind in some respects, but I think it's true. Well, this applies to writing. The thing about my style as a writer is that I like to make realistic characters who are very well fleshed out and who are people that you can meet on the street if they were transported into our world, if I'm writing a story that doesn't take place in our world. And there is there's a problem with that. When you are engaged in storytelling in any medium, but it's even more noticeable in writing than it is in some of the visual media. You can't do that. You cannot realistically, most of the time, portray a character very deeply, very realistically. And in fact, when we engage in consuming stories, when we listen or watch stories, we're looking for a handful of distinctive traits that make a character stand out in our minds. Usually these traits are even going to be exaggerated traits, like a caricature, because that's just so distinctive. Oh, here's the person who's a big jock and walks around and is always saying some beefy, stupid thing, and oh, here's the artist who is whimsical and profound, and people like that. I like that. That's clear, because what happens is that we fill in the blanks. We project ourselves onto the blank space that constitutes most of a fictional character. The few traits that we're given are just they're seeds. I forget the word, but they're very little of the overall character. They're just a handful of traits, and we build the rest. And that's also how we operate in real life. We think we know people a lot more than we actually know them much of the time, because we are projecting ourselves onto other people without even realizing it. And when I was talking with my friend, and she was upset about this community she was trying to engage with, and there was this one person whom she kind of liked, but she really disliked his friends, I ventured the speculation that it was because she didn't actually know him all that well, or his friends. And if she did know him better, she would probably either like him less or like his friends more. Not always, it's not necessarily true, it's speculation, but I think that is something that applies in general a lot of the time in the real world. And so getting back to fictional characters, excuse me, I can never talk for long. I'm not a very telegenic person. When it comes to fictional characters, we also don't really know them all that well. When we're shown a caricature and we just fill in the blanks with ourselves, that is more of a self-interaction than anything else. And writing very realistic characters is very hard, because it leads to things that make a story harder to follow. One of the great truths about people is that we behave differently in different circumstances, whereas fictional characters are usually pretty consistent in how they behave. That's a fallacy that people make. We often, if someone cuts us off on the road, we'll often call them a jerk or an idiot and think that that's just the way they live their lives all the time. But, I mean, obviously that's not true. There's more nuance there. Fitting that nuance into a medium, especially a written medium, where you can't just pan the camera or let it sit on a person for a minute and just watch them acting. Fitting all of that into a person is hard, because it leads to inconsistent behavior, or behavior that seems inconsistent because there's actually a lot of different stuff going on in their head, and different environments could provoke very different reactions. Even the same environment can provoke different reactions if the stuff going on inside their head and their body is different from on one occasion versus another. Well, so you get this great big gulf. I go out of bounds on the camera here, but on one end you have the caricatures that are very easy to follow, and on the other end you have fully realistic characters. And in between, if you try and make a character more realistic, but don't really make the commitment to completely flesh them out, what happens is that I think the story often suffers for it, because it's very unwieldy to fit all of these characteristics in a reasonable amount of time, to make them all seem like they fit together, to make them flow well. And I wouldn't even recommend that a lot of writers try it. And on this end, the fully realistic character, you're talking a huge commitment with regards to the number of words, your word count. You cannot do that with all the characters in your book, unless it's a book about one character. You just can't, and it won't fit in short form anything. It won't fit in poetry or short poems. It won't fit in short stories, novellas, maybe a novella. you need a lot of space. What you really need is a continuing series where you can add a little more day by day, and eventually you start to get to the bottom of this character, because most people are simple with respect to their personality and temperament. The complexity comes from the many different characteristics and their different interactions in different situations. But the overall temperament is not that hard to figure out, and you'll figure that out pretty easily. You can fit that in shorter form works, but in a continuing series where you have a lot of space to add words, you can really get into the different combinations of character traits and thereby more fully portray the character. So my worst nightmare as a writer and as a storyteller is that this is going to sound silly, or maybe it won't, because I've just spent all these minutes explaining it, but I feel like a fraud. I feel like, with one exception, all of my characters are not realistic, and that they're just, on some level, just caricatures. And that's because, on some level, they are. They're not fully realistic. They're shorthand, and the reader is left to fill in most of the details. And I've noticed, the reason it was on my mind is that I've noticed in writing Maid of Sonn, and especially the Great Galavar, I've been having some real trouble with characterizations. Even with important characters like Galavar and Afiak, and I was wondering to myself, why is this? I know about these characters. Why am I having so much trouble? And it's because that there is so much more to be fleshed out, and I'm trying to treat them as if they're fully fleshed out. But what the writing on the page says is that they're not there yet. And for me, it just isn't satisfactory to be a caricature off on this side or somewhere in the Gulf. I want a fully realistic character, and that itself isn't realistic. So the fraud is doomed to continue. I mentioned there was one exception, and that's Silence, and that's because she's an alter ego, and I'm always thinking about her. As I'm going about my daily life, I'm thinking to myself, well, here's what she would be doing. Here's how she would be responding to this. And I don't do that with any other character, for the most part. Sometimes, especially when I'm working on them a lot, but never anyone as consistently. And that's it. That's kind of what it takes to get a fully fleshed out character whose reaction you will have ready on command at any time because you just know them that well. That's just not going to happen, and so that is something that I kind of have to come to grips with. I mean, it's a ridiculously high standard to hold oneself to as a writer. People write wonderful stories without fleshing out their characters all the way, and I suffer from no delusion that this is somehow necessary to make good writing, but it is a standard that I would like to that I end up holding myself to, and that holding myself up to, and that I would like to do better at. But better is hard, and better takes work. So that's my worst nightmare as a writer, that these characters I'm writing are all frauds and they don't seem realistic, and you can't differentiate them from one another because they're, even to the extent that I have put traits into them, they're also reasonable, and the reasonableness just blends together, and it's all one big farce. It's not really, but that's nightmares don't always have to be completely reasonable. So I said I would talk about two things, but looks like we've used up our time, so I guess that's it for this month. What is your worst nightmare as an aspiring writer? Tell me about that, and until next time, cheers.